A video about why Bronze-era lifters had flat chests has been watched millions of times. Somewhere in that footage, a viewer paused on a frame, not at the chest, not at the deltoids, but at the midsection, at a waist so narrow relative to the man's overall size that the proportion stopped them completely. They posted a question in the comment section that nobody answered. This video is the answer to that question. What you're looking at when you freeze that footage isn't a coincidence of genetics or a consequence of light, aesthetic training. Eugen Sandow weighed between 185 and 195 pounds at 5 feet 9. His documented measurements, recorded in his own anthropometric charts, reprinted in his 1894 book Sandow on Physical Training, show a 30-inch waist against a 48-inch chest and 18-inch arms. George Hackenschmidt, the first recognized world heavyweight wrestling champion, competed at around 200 pounds at 5 feet 6 inches. Secondary sources attribute to him a chest of approximately 48 inches and a waist in the 30-inch range. The chest-to-waist differential on both men runs to approximately 18 inches. Modern training logic produces a clear prediction for what heavy compound loading does to the midsection. It thickens it. Loaded squats brace the trunk. Heavy pressing develops the obliques. Progressive overload enlarges everything, including the waist. By that logic, the men putting the heaviest weights overhead in recorded history should have had the widest midsections. The Bronze Era doesn't support that prediction. Hackenschmidt was pressing 269 pounds overhead with one arm and reportedly carrying a 30-inch waist. That's not a light aesthetic competitor. That's a professional heavyweight wrestler who built his career on the conviction, stated in his own 1908 book, that it's only by exercising with heavy weights that any man can hope to develop really great strength. 3 factors explain the anomaly. The first is architectural, a proportionality system deliberately designed to produce a narrow waist. The second is physiological, a pharmaceutical mechanism that systematically dismantled what the architectural system built. The third is a loading pattern shift, whose effects on midsection dimensions are well-reasoned but not yet experimentally confirmed. Together, they answer what the comments couldn't fully articulate. The architectural foundation begins not in a gym but in a museum. Eugen Sandow was born Friedrich Wilhelm Müller in Königsberg, Prussia, on April 2, 1867, the son of a jeweler. He arrived in London in 1889 as a 22-year-old without reputation, entered a strongman competition at the Royal Aquarium, and beat the reigning champions Samson and his protege Cyclops in the same evening. Fame arrived immediately. Within weeks, he was performing at the Alhambra Theater for sold-out crowds, and within months, he was appearing before royalty. But the contest he was most preoccupied with wasn't against other strongmen. It was against stone. His 1894 book, Sandow on Physical Training, published in New York by J. Selwyn Tate & Sons, compiled under his direction by G. Mercer Adam, survives in full on archive.org. The table of contents includes, in Chapter 3, an entry that reads, "Visits Rome with his father and admires classical sculpture. Decline of the physical ideal." The chapter is there. The museum visits are documented in his own primary text. Whether the specific timing of the Italian trip occurred exactly as the biographical accounts describe is a question Sandow's most thorough biographer, David Chapman, acknowledged may never be fully resolved. What can be verified is what happened afterward. Sandow moved through museums with a tape measure, applied it to classical sculptures, recorded the circumferences in notebooks, and spent the rest of his professional life engineering his own body to match what he found. The statues he worked from were specific, and the most important of them has a documented history spanning 2,000 years. The Farnese Hercules, a 10-foot Roman marble copy created by the sculptor Glycon for the Baths of Caracalla around 212 AD, derived from a Lysippos bronze original made near the time of Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE, was excavated during Renaissance excavations in 1546, acquired by Cardinal Farnese for the Palazzo Farnese in Rome, given new legs by a protege of Michelangelo, and eventually moved to what is now the National Archaeological Museum in Naples, where it still stands. Historical accounts confirm that Sandow emulated the Farnese Hercules in a series of famous photographs by Napoleon Cerroni, and that he credited viewing classical statuary as a child with establishing the direction of his life. In 1893, Sandow stood in Napoleon Cerroni's New York studio and reenacted the exact pose of the Farnese Hercules, one hand behind the back, the head turned to one side, the weight shifted onto one leg, the torso twisted slightly at the hip, the abdominal wall exposed and contracted. The photographs that resulted were among the most widely reproduced images of the physical culture era. They weren't posed to demonstrate performance. They were documentation of a measurement goal being achieved. The shape of the man in the photograph corresponds, within the constraints of biological individuality, to the proportions Sandow had found in the stone. Then, in 1899, Sandow placed a plaster cast of the Farnese in his London gymnasium, not as decoration, but as a working reference, the dimensional standard against which his own measurements and his students' measurements would be evaluated. He also measured the discobolus and the dying gall, tracking the same proportional relationships across multiple bodies and multiple periods. What Sandow called the Grecian ideal emerged from that process. As one account of his methodology describes, by measuring the circumferences of body parts on these statues, Sandow noticed a lot of the proportions were consistent. The consistent proportions became known as the Grecian ideal. The process was metric, not interpretive. He recorded what he found and built a training system around closing the gap between those numbers and his own. Modern analysts who have mapped the Grecian ideal to establish geometric ratios identify the shoulder-to-waist proportion that Sandow's physique embodied as approximately 1.618 to 1, the golden ratio. Sandow may not have consciously known the mathematical name for what he was deriving. One account suggests his system revolved around the golden ratio without his knowing it, meaning the number emerged from the measurement process as an output rather than a consciously applied formula. At a 30-inch waist against approximately 47 to 48 inches across the shoulders, his proportions sit close to that classical number. The small waist wasn't incidental within this system. An academic account of the Grecian ideal's structural components states it plainly. The small waist, wide shoulders, flat chest, defined core, and symmetry are structural elements of the Grecian ideal. Structural elements. The entire visual architecture of the classical male physique is built on contrast between shoulder width and waist width. A thicker waist doesn't only undermine proportion aesthetically, it collapses the ratio that defines the whole design. The denominator grows, and the result no longer approaches 1.618. How seriously Sandow treated that ratio can be measured by what he allowed to be done to his body in 1901. Professor Ray Lancaster, curator at what is now the Natural History Museum in London, had decided that Sandow's physique was sufficiently representative of the proportional ideal to warrant being cast in plaster for public display. Lancaster's rationale? The cast would demonstrate to the public that the muscular proportions visible in Greek and Roman sculpture across European museums weren't artistic invention, but physiologically achievable. Wide shoulders, narrow waist, defined midsection. Not idealized marble, but a living body that had matched those measurements through systematic training. The casting process began in July 1901 at the studio of Messrs. Bruciani and Company on Great Russell Street, London. Plaster was applied to sections of Sandow's body and allowed to harden. Each section required a minimum of 15 minutes to set. During that time, Sandow had to remain motionless, hold his muscles in full contraction, and breathe without allowing the movement of his chest or abdomen to disturb the outer contour of the mold. He described the ordeal in recorded remarks. "I regard it as the greatest feat of endurance I have ever performed." He continued, "Good heavens, time and time again, I thought I'd have given up. The strain was awful. I used to finish after each piece was done, fairly blown, perspiring and winded, much more than after the most arduous weightlifting competition I have ever accomplished. One feels as if one were being suffocated, especially when the mold of the face is being taken. I had to keep the muscles of the chest and abdomen still, and take very small, quick breaths, never entirely filling or emptying the lungs, but just taking in, almost continuously, enough fresh air to take the place of that I used up, at the same time keeping the muscles set so as not to disturb the outer contour. The process lasted an entire month. Section by section, over 30 days, his proportions were preserved in plaster. A man who had spent years training his midsection to specific dimensional targets spent a month holding those dimensions locked in contraction while cast material hardened around them, maintaining, as he put it, the outer contour of a form he had spent decades deriving from stone. Lancaster's intended message to the museum's public was explicit. The narrow waist and wide shoulders visible in the classical statues were achievable. The cast went on display in July 1901 and was removed 3 months later, not because it failed to make the proportional argument, but because a naked, muscular man in a scientific institution exceeded what Victorian proprieties would tolerate. The original life casts survived in storage. In the 1990s, a representative of Arnold Schwarzenegger contacted the museum with a request, a reproduction for his personal collection. In the basement of the Natural History Museum, nearly a century after they were first made, the casts were reassembled and recast and shipped across the Atlantic. The training system that produced those dimensions was documented throughout Sandow's books. His heavyweight exercise section in the 1894 book is dominated by overhead work. One-handed lifts from the floor to the shoulder, one-arm slow presses from the shoulder to overhead, two-hand barbell lifts to full extension, one-hand snatch lifts from the floor. More than 40 exercises appear across his 2 primary books. His prescribed abdominal exercise, the straight leg sit-up, appears in his own text with these instructions. Lie flat on the back on the floor, the arms close by the sides, the feet pushed under a bureau or weighted. Then alternately raise the body on the hip joints, from the supine to the sitting position, and slowly lower it again to the horizontal position, repeating the movements until the abdominal muscles feel the tiring effect of the exercise. After a time, when the pupil has accustomed himself to the strain of the movement, he may render it more difficult by taking a dumbbell in each hand. The movement is a full-range trunk raise from supine to sitting, loaded progressively over time. The midsection was trained with progressive resistance as a structural priority, not shaped passively by compound movements. His physical culture schools across Britain and North America issued anthropometric charts to students. They tracked the waist alongside the chest, the arms, the legs. The narrow waist was a numerical training target in the same category as an arm measurement. The Mr. Olympia trophy, presented annually to the winner of professional bodybuilding's premier contest, was modeled on Sandow's physique. The gold figurine handed to every champion is still a miniature Eugen Sandow. The narrow waist, the wide shoulders, the 30-inch measurement against the 48-inch chest, cast in miniature and presented as the sport's highest standard. George Hackenschmidt's training philosophy had nothing to do with proportion or aesthetics. Born in Estonia in 1877, he turned professional around 1900, and over the following 8 years, compiled a wrestling record that passed 2,000 matches without a loss. He lost to Frank Gotch at the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in Chicago in April 1908, a defeat he attributed to a legitimate contest, and lost a rematch in 1911 under disputed circumstances he spent the rest of his life contesting, claiming Gotch's training partner had deliberately injured his knee before the bout. Between those 2 losses, he was the most physically formidable competitive wrestler alive. His 1908 book, The Way to Live in Health and Physical Fitness, isn't an aesthetics guide. It's a philosophical argument for the primacy of heavy resistance training in producing genuine physical capacity. Its central thesis: it's only by exercising with heavy weights that any man can hope to develop really great strength. He was equally clear about the limits of alternatives. Manual labor alone is therefore not the source of strength. The distinction positioned Hackenschmidt as someone who arrived at a heavy resistance training protocol through performance logic. He was training to win matches, not to match a statue. His documented competition-era records reflect that orientation. Period accounts show a 269-pound one-arm shoulder press, a 256-pound snatch, and a 251-pound jerk. He also credited himself with a 334-pound floor press. Multiple historical sources attribute to him something that complicates a simple overhead-only narrative. Around 1899, He reportedly rolled a barbell over his face while lying supine and pressed it to lockout, executing what we now call the bench press, possibly inventing it. Hackenschmidt didn't avoid horizontal pressing. His strength record includes it. But his competitive identity was built around overhead lifts, and when historians catalog his most significant strength achievements, the overhead records dominate the list. Secondary sources place him at around 200 pounds at 5 feet 6 inches. Period sources also attribute to him a chest of approximately 48 inches and a waist reportedly close to 30 inches. If those secondary figures are accurate, and the waist figure specifically comes from secondary rather than primary documentation, the chest-to-waist differential runs to approximately 18 inches on a professional heavyweight wrestler. At his competition weight, before any exogenous pharmaceutical compound existed in the sport, the midsection he carried was proportionally consistent with what Sandow's system had explicitly designed toward. He also wrote, "Health can never be divorced from strength." Not an incidental observation, a foundational claim that the architecture strength produces and the architecture of genuine health are the same architecture. He died in 1968 at age 90, the longest-lived serious strength athlete in the documented history of the sport, training heavily throughout his competitive career and remaining physically active into old age without ever touching Dianabol, because Dianabol didn't exist until he was 80 years old. The first signal that would end all of this arrived in Vienna in the autumn of 1954. The World Weightlifting Championships that year drew the most competitive Soviet team American sport administrators had yet encountered. Dr. John Bosley Ziegler was the U.S. team physician, a Maryland-born doctor who had served as a military surgeon and who worked closely with the York Barbell Club, then the hub of American competitive weightlifting. What Ziegler observed at the Vienna Championships and what he confirmed through his access to the Soviet team's medical situation was that Soviet athletes were using testosterone. Multiple academic sources document this account. Ziegler returned to the United States. He began experimenting with testosterone himself and with weightlifters at the York Barbell Club, where Bob Hoffman ran the facility. 4 years later, in 1958, Ciba Pharmaceuticals released methandrostenalone under the brand name Dianabol. Multiple peer-reviewed sources confirm this timeline. Ziegler is referenced in historical accounts as the father of Dianabol. The drug was a synthetic testosterone derivative, more anabolic and less androgenic than testosterone itself, designed to shift the ratio toward tissue-building effect. Dianabol entering competitive bodybuilding meant a shift in what was physiologically achievable. Body composition changed. Mass increased at rates that natural training couldn't match. The competitive visual baseline began moving. But the more architecturally significant disruption came later, from a different compound. From a combination of two compounds whose combined use in competitive bodybuilding didn't become prevalent until the late 1980s. Human growth hormone paired with insulin. Here is the mechanism, as documented in clinical endocrinology literature. Human growth hormone administered exogenously, synthetic HGH injected into the body, signals the liver to produce insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1. IGF-1 is the downstream anabolic signal. It drives cellular growth, tissue regeneration, and protein synthesis throughout the body. The clinical summary. When synthetic HGH is administered, it increases levels of insulin-like growth factor 1, a hormone that drives cellular growth and tissue regeneration. While this effect is desirable for building muscle and accelerating recovery, IGF-1 doesn't discriminate. It stimulates growth in all tissues, including internal organs. Every tissue that receives IGF-1 signaling responds with growth. Muscle tissue responds. The liver responds. The kidneys respond. Research on chronic growth hormone administration has documented that chronic administration of growth hormone in healthy adults results in a significant increase in lean body mass and organ weight, particularly of the liver and kidneys. The intestinal lining responds too. IGF-1 stimulates proliferation of the cells lining the intestinal wall, increasing intestinal mass and colon volume. The entire digestive tract can hypertrophy. None of those organs are on the outside of the body. They sit inside the abdominal cavity surrounded by the abdominal wall. When they grow, not from fat deposition, but from actual tissue proliferation, they press outward against the anterior abdominal wall from inside. The waist circumference increases not because of subcutaneous fat accumulation or muscle development, but because the organs physically occupy more volume and push outward against the interior of the abdominal wall, regardless of what happens to the exterior. Insulin, the second compound in the late 1980s protocol, works synergistically with growth hormone to amplify the effect. Clinical sources describe the interaction. Insulin therapy can lead to visceral fat accumulation and distension through enhanced glycogenesis and lipogenesis, especially when combined with HGH. The two compounds together produce a level of visceral distension that neither drives as severely in isolation. The first documented introduction of this combined protocol into competitive bodybuilding occurred in the late 1980s. That is exactly when abdominal hypertrophy syndrome began appearing on competitive stages in its most severe and visible form. In competitive bodybuilding, the condition is called palumboism. In clinical medicine, the peer-reviewed journal Curious documents it as abdominal hypertrophy syndrome, an uncommon condition affecting bodybuilders and athletes engaged in prolonged usage of growth hormone, insulin, and other performance-enhancing drugs. Doses of GH has been linked to organ enlargement. The distended abdomen visible on extreme-era professional competitors isn't a fat accumulation problem. It's an organ volume problem. The architectural distinction between those two is the key to understanding why the pharmaceutical era produced a permanent transformation of midsection structure in competitive bodybuilding, not merely a temporary visual outcome. Subcutaneous fat, the layer between skin and muscle, responds to caloric restriction. Reduce caloric intake and the body mobilizes fat stores. The subcutaneous layer decreases. A competitive athlete can reach extremely low body fat percentages through disciplined preparation, and the underlying musculature is exposed. This is standard competition preparation. Visceral organ hypertrophy doesn't operate on that logic. The liver doesn't shrink on a caloric deficit. The intestinal tissue stimulated by IGF-1 doesn't decrease when carbohydrates are restricted. A bodybuilder can arrive on a competition stage at under 5% body fat, as lean as the human body can be managed, and still carry a distended midsection, because the distension isn't external. It's coming from the volume of liver, kidney, and intestinal tissue pressing outward against the abdominal wall from inside the cavity, independent of what happens to the fat layer on the outside. The permanence is documented directly in clinical literature. Chronic high-dose HGH use can lead to permanent organ enlargement, especially of the heart, liver, kidneys, and intestines. This condition is called visceromegaly, and while low to moderate doses used cyclically may not cause significant growth, long-term abuse can lead to structural changes that are difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. Difficult to reverse. That is what turns the "can't get it back" claim from a lament into a clinical statement. The ratio Sandow's entire system was built around gets destroyed not because the waist thickens with fat, but because the organs physically occupy more volume inside the abdomen and push the waist outward from within. No training protocol addresses that. No caloric deficit addresses that. The architecture is gone from the inside, and in cases of prolonged, severe use, it stays gone. The timeline of this transformation runs in a traceable sequence. Dianabol entered competitive sport after 1958. Anabolic steroids changed the sport's physiological baseline significantly over the following decade, and by the mid-1960s, PED use was prevalent enough in professional bodybuilding that the competitive norms had shifted. The complete structural dismantling of the classical waist-to-shoulder architecture, the organ-driven, internal, largely irreversible widening, accelerated with the HGH and insulin protocols that became widespread in the late 1980s. Before 1958, the abdominal cavity of every competitive bodybuilder contained organs that had grown at the rate natural physiology permits. The waist circumference was determined by the skeleton, the musculature, and the subcutaneous fat layer, all responsive to training and nutrition. The midsection could be shaped from the outside. The classical ratio was achievable. After the full pharmaceutical cascade ran through the sport, the midsection was being pushed outward from the inside regardless of what happened externally. The comments pointing toward gear were identifying the right mechanism. What they left unspecified is that gear didn't only produce the bubble gut visible on stage. It dismantled the waist-to-hip architecture that Sandow's proportionality system required as a structural foundation, permanently in the athletes who use these compounds heavily enough for long enough. The cleanest before/after comparison in the sport's documented history runs from the mid-1940s to the mid-1950s. Steve Reeves won Mr. America in 1947. He won Mr. Universe in 1950. Dianabol entered the commercial market in 1958. Every competition Reeves ever entered, he entered with an abdominal cavity that no exogenous anabolic compound had touched. His self-reported peak measurements include a 29-inch waist at approximately 215 pounds and 6 feet 1. Jan Todd, in academic work on his career, described him as a competitor who struck poses that showed his wide shoulders and narrow waist to advantage. His proportional architecture is the canonical visual anchor for the last natural generation in competitive bodybuilding at the championship level. The sharper data point is Reg Park, because a first-person eyewitness account of his specific dimensions exists, and because Park was built more heavily than Reeves, which makes the proportion he carried more striking. Park was born in Leeds, England in 1928. He had trained through wartime food rationing in Britain, conditions that, as Joe Weider would later note, make what Park achieved in that period more remarkable than the photographs alone suggest. Protein was in short supply in England for years after the war ended, and those were Park's formative training years. When he arrived in New York for his first American visit in 1950, Weider arranged a photo session and brought the writer Barton Horvath to document what he found. Park took off his jacket, then his shirt. Horvath recorded what he saw. My first impression of him was his hugeness. Standing 6 feet 1 inch in his stocking feet and weighing 225 pounds of solid muscle, in clothes, he was one of the most impressive figures I had ever seen. From tip to tip, his shoulders measure more than 24 inches across. His column-like neck also drew my attention. A size 19 shirt fitted snugly. As he took off his shirt, my eyes bulged. His trapezius development was absolutely the most massive I had ever seen. The undershirt was next, revealing a 51-inch normal chest. Shoulders round as grapefruits, pectorals the size of half of a football, upper arms that swell the tape to well over 18 inches, and all this tapering down to a perfectly muscled 31-inch waist. Weider noted at the end of that session that Park wasn't in competitive condition. He had done only sporadic training in the month before leaving England for the United States. 31 inches against 51 inches, at 225 pounds. Undertrained. Park went on to become the first bodybuilder in history to bench press 500 pounds, to squat 600 pounds for repetitions, and to deadlift 700 pounds. He pressed 300 pounds behind the neck and curled 200 pounds. He was the strongest competitive bodybuilder of his generation, possibly the strongest who had yet competed in the sport. None of that strength was built with pharmaceutical assistance, because in 1950, pharmaceutical assistance of that kind didn't exist. And when he came back to win Mr. Universe outright in 1951, it still didn't exist. The inflection point arrived in 1958, not because every athlete immediately adopted Dianabol, but because the competitive advantage it provided began pulling the sport in a direction that natural athletes couldn't match indefinitely. The visual gap between the Park and Reeves era and the competitive physiques that would dominate 2 decades later isn't primarily a comparison of muscular size. It's a comparison of midsection architecture. The waist-to-shoulder differential that had defined the classical physique throughout the Bronze and Silver eras was giving way to a new physiological normal defined from the inside out. The viewers who pause footage from the 1940s and 1950s and ask about the waist are identifying, without necessarily naming it, the last era when the architecture Sandow had designed toward still existed intact in the sport's competitive tier. The third factor is different from the first two in a fundamental way, and that difference needs to be stated and held throughout. Bronze-era training was overwhelmingly overhead dominant. The competitive tradition, the physical culture canon, and the strongman exhibition circuit were all built around putting things overhead as the primary expression of upper body strength. The one-arm press, the two-hand jerk, the snatch, the bent press. Not because horizontal pressing was philosophically prohibited, but because the canonical demonstration of upper body strength was vertical, and the training that developed it followed the competition. Arthur Saxon provides the most documented illustration of what this training canon looked like in complete form. Born in Leipzig on April 28, 1878, Saxon published The Development of Physical Power in 1906 and opened that book with a straightforward priority: strength and power in an athlete, quite regardless of muscular development. His training was built almost entirely on overhead movements. The chapter structure of his book reads like a list of vertical lifts: bent press, side press, one-arm jerk, one-arm snatch, two-hand military press, two-hand jerk. His bent press record, lifting a weight from the shoulder to full overhead lockout while side bending the torso beneath it, stood at 370 pounds. His two hands anyhow record, combining one arm pressing overhead while the other hauls a second implement from the floor, reached 448 pounds. Sandow's own heavy training follows the same vertical orientation. His 1894 book's heavyweight section contains one-handed lifts from the floor to the shoulder, one-arm slow presses from the shoulder to overhead, two-hand barbell lifts to full extension, and one-hand snatch lifts. The overhead press, and its many single-arm variations, was the primary loaded movement in both systems. The bench press, as the dominant training method for upper body development, didn't arrive in that role until the 1940s and 1950s. Multiple historical sources confirm that bodybuilders adopted horizontal pressing with serious competitive application in that period, with men like Marvin Eder and George Eiferman among the early advocates. Before that transition, the dominant loading pattern was vertical. The biomechanical hypothesis connecting this shift to midsection development works as follows. Pressing a weight overhead requires the core musculature to manage a different force vector than horizontal pressing does. Under a heavy overhead press, the spine is loaded axially, with the obliques and transverse abdominis bracing against the tendency of the load to pull the torso into lateral flexion or extension. Under unilateral overhead loading, a one-arm press, a bent press, those demands intensify. The contralateral obliques and quadratus lumborum must actively resist the lateral imbalance created by asymmetric loading to keep the torso aligned under the weight. General biomechanical principles establish that carrying a heavy load with one arm creates a trunk imbalance requiring the opposite side's deep musculature to fire continuously to maintain spinal alignment. The bent press amplifies this further, requiring controlled lateral flexion throughout the range of motion under full overhead lockout, producing sustained demands on the entire lateral chain of the midsection in a pattern that bilateral horizontal pressing doesn't replicate. Sustained over years, this loading pattern may produce a core musculature that is dense in its stabilizing function while remaining controlled in external dimensions, as distinct from the midsection broadening that can accompany years of heavy bilateral horizontal pressing combined with loaded squatting and deadlifting in extended caloric surplus. The honest qualification stays: there is no direct comparative data. No controlled study has tracked long-term waist circumference changes in groups training overhead dominantly versus bench dominantly over equivalent periods. The hypothesis is built from biomechanical principles about core recruitment under different loading vectors. It's a well-reasoned inference from available evidence, not a confirmed cause. Presenting it as established would be overclaiming. What the evidence does establish is a consistent correlation. The men who trained overhead dominantly in a pharmaceutical-free environment within a proportionality system that treated the waist as a tracked numerical target produced the midsection architecture that viewers now identify as anomalous when they see it. When horizontal pressing displaced overhead pressing as the dominant training pattern in the 1940s and 1950s, the loading shift coincided exactly with the beginning of the pharmaceutical era. Both variables changed simultaneously. Their individual contributions to what followed are difficult to separate, which is itself a reason to take the overhead hypothesis seriously rather than dismiss it. The phrase, "can't get it back," deserves a direct answer because it's partly accurate and largely misleading, depending entirely on who is asking. For individuals who have chronically used high-dose exogenous HGH over extended periods, organ hypertrophy may be genuinely structural and largely permanent. The clinical literature states it directly. Long-term abuse can lead to structural changes that are difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. If the liver and intestines have grown and maintained that growth, the abdominal architecture is compromised from the inside in ways that training and diet can't address. That is a real clinical condition. The question the comment was asking, what routine produced a waist like that, isn't directed at post-pharmaceutical bodies attempting structural recovery. It's asking what conditions produced the classical midsection in the first place. The answer to that question isn't something unrecoverable. Natural lifters who have never introduced exogenous HGH or insulin don't carry structurally enlarged organs. Their abdominal cavities contain organs that grew at the rate natural physiology allows, organs that fit the space they were designed to occupy. The classical waist-to-shoulder architecture is accessible. The ratio Sandow system required is achievable. Drug-tested competitors are achieving it right now at significant body weights because those proportions don't require pharmaceutical support. They require training toward them. Here's what training toward them actually looks like, drawn from the specific conditions that produce the Bronze Era midsection. The first principle is proportionality as a tracked numerical target. Sandow's system was built on measurement. He didn't train to get bigger and hope proportion emerged. He measured the statues, derived the ratios, measured his own body against those ratios, and trained the gap between where he was and where the classical numbers required him to be. His physical culture schools issued anthropometric charts. Students recorded the waist alongside the chest, the arms, the legs. The narrow waist was a dimensional target in the same category as an arm measurement or a strength benchmark. The ratio he was working toward was approximately 1.618 shoulders to waist, a shoulder circumference measuring roughly 1.6 times the waist circumference. At his documented measurements, a 48-inch chest implies approximately 47 to 48 inches across the shoulders. Against a 30-inch waist, the ratio is approximately 1.57 to 1.60, close to the classical figure from the statues. If you aren't measuring your waist and tracking it against your shoulder circumference, you don't know whether your training is moving you toward or away from the classical proportion. Sandow's students knew that number every week. Start measuring it. Set a specific ratio target. Train toward that number with the same intentionality you'd bring to a strength goal. The second principle is overhead loading as a structural priority. The Bronze Era training canon was vertical before it was horizontal. One-arm pressing, bent press variations, unilateral overhead lifting, these were the primary heavy movements, not accessories positioned after the bench press in the program hierarchy. Sandow's heavy exercise section is dominated by overhead lifts. Hackenschmidt's recorded strength achievements are overhead lifts. Saxon built his entire competitive career on overhead records. Whether this loading pattern directly narrows the waist or simply avoids the loading conditions that can broaden it remains an open biomechanical question. What it does is replace bilateral horizontal pressing as the sole upper body strength stimulus with a vertical pattern that demands substantially different core activation, particularly in unilateral and asymmetric variations. Including substantial overhead pressing as a primary category, ideally with meaningful unilateral loading, is the most operationally straightforward step toward replicating the training conditions the Bronze Era produced consistently. The third principle is caloric environment. Bronze Era physiques weren't built through prolonged caloric surplus. These men ate to support training output, not to drive mass accumulation at maximum rate. Sandow's dietary philosophy from his own books emphasized natural, sufficient foods without chronic excess. He wrote that he was no believer in a special diet, still less in a rigid one, as necessary while training, meaning he ate to sustain training capacity, not to engineer a bulk and cut cycle. The modern protocol of spending months in significant caloric surplus to build tissue, then cutting to reveal it, builds subcutaneous fat around the midsection during the building phase, at the same rate it builds everything else. A 30-inch waist doesn't survive a sustained surplus and emerge cleanly from a cut. The classical midsection architecture was built in conditions that didn't include that protocol. Maintaining a modest caloric environment, eating to support training without chronic excess, is one of the underlying conditions, not merely an aesthetic preference. The fourth principle is direct abdominal training as a primary category. In Sandow's 1894 text, the straight leg sit-up appears with progressive loading built into the prescription from the beginning. Start body weight, add dumbbells of increasing weight as capacity develops, eventually hold dumbbells overhead while performing the full range trunk raise. The midsection was loaded with progressive resistance using the same logical structure he applied to every other muscle group. Side bends appear in his documented exercise lists. Overhead pressing and pullovers appear in the same training sessions as direct abdominal work. The midsection was actively developed as a structural training priority, not shaped passively by compound movements and then ignored. These four conditions, proportionality tracking, overhead loading, controlled caloric environment, direct progressive abdominal training, appear consistently across the athletes whose midsection architecture produced the footage viewers keep stopping to examine. Sandow held a 30-inch waist at 190 pounds while engineering the training system around it. Hackenschmidt reportedly maintained approximately the same measurement at 200 pounds while pressing 269 pounds overhead with one arm. Reg Park carried a 31-inch waist at 225 pounds in off condition, and Barton Horvath measured it in person in 1950, 8 years before Diana Ball existed. The pattern holds across weights, heights, training philosophies, and competitive contexts. What those men shared was the pharmaceutical environment, the proportionality orientation, and the overhead-weighted training canon. The Bronze Era midsection wasn't destroyed by bad training. It was dismantled by a pharmaceutical mechanism that physically expanded the abdominal organs outward, operating inside a competitive incentive structure that rewarded mass accumulation over proportion during an era that had already shifted the primary loading pattern from vertical to horizontal. Each of those changes ran in the same direction. Together, they transformed the midsection architecture of competitive bodybuilding from the inside and the outside simultaneously. What the Bronze Era had was a set of conditions that produced a specific structural outcome. Those conditions still exist for natural lifters. The Farnese Hercules is still in Naples. Its proportions still describe something human physiology can produce. Sandow's anthropometric charts still show the measurements. Weider's account of Park's 31-inch waist at 225 pounds in off condition is still in print at the Stark Center at the University of Texas. The waist in that footage is what Sandow designed it to be when he ran a tape measure across the Farnese marble in the 1890s. It was a measurement target then. For natural lifters, it still is. Subscribe for more on how the Bronze Era training systems translate to practical modern programming.